Looks like Trump is ending waivers to countries who purchase Iranian oil. As you may remember, this past fall, Trump issued a bunch of new sanctions on Iran, and they looked really bad for the oil market and were going to drive up prices. But then, at the last minute, he issued waivers to a bunch of countries who buy up most of Iran's oil to allow them to continue doing so. So the sanctions were, in effect, symbolic. But of course, that then gave the President of the United States direct control over these certain countries' access to oil, such as Taiwan, Greece, Italy, Japan, South Korea. Now, a few of these countries, not wanting to be held hostage by the President of the United States, decided to stop importing Iranian oil on their own and just sort of wean themselves off of it. But at least South Korea and Japan are still using quite a bit of Iranian oil, so they're going to be in a lot of trouble. But of course, it's not just South Korea and Japan that have to find new oil suppliers. The whole oil market now is going to be disrupted by this because there's a sudden drop in the oil supply. And on this news, oil's already up $1.40 a barrel this morning. And the way these sanctions are structured, they're not just on Iran themselves. They're on any country that deals with Iran. So if Japan decided, say, to keep buying Iranian oil, the United States would sanction Japan. And so, of course, no country is actually going then to violate the sanctions and deal with Iran. So the end result is we get oil at 6-month highs. Supposedly, though, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are cooperating with the U.S. on this effort, and they plan to ramp up production to make up for the reduction in crude coming out of Iran. The idea, of course, being trying to stabilize the price of oil so we don't see a massive spike, which would in turn disrupt the global economy and not just the Iranian economy. And so, of course, by cutting off oil exports for Iran so that they can't sell their oil to anybody, the idea is that you choke them out and that they don't have enough money, and eventually the people will revolt against the government. That's kind of the theory working here. The idea is that if the U.S. imposes sanctions, which send Iran into a crippling recession or depression, that people will blame the government and not the United States. Now, I think this is a rather dubious idea. Even if they overthrow the mullahs and install another government so that the sanctions come off of them from the U.S., I don't think that that new government will be fond of the U.S., considering that the U.S. put them in that position to begin with. If the Chinese figured out some way to cripple the American economy, I can't see the American people rallying around China and trying to put in some sort of like military junta who is allied with the Chinese. So I think this is a pretty harebrained neocon scheme. I think that these sorts of regime change operations work a lot better when the U.S. is not out front supporting the coup. You may remember the only successful coup really was the coup in Chile, and that worked because the U.S. denied vehemently that they were involved. It seemed completely local and organic. Of course, even with these sanctions, there's still going to be oil smuggled out of Iran. There's always oil smuggled out of Iran. Iran has probably been planning for a long time for the risk of the U.S. sanctioning them in this way, and so they've made contingency plans, and while they won't be able to sell their oil for as much as they will on the legitimate market, Iran will be able to sell people this sort of contraband crude at a discounted rate because of the risk that it carries of having the U.S.'s wrath. But nonetheless, Iran will find buyers. So they won't be paid as much money, but they'll still get some money for their oil. So the sanctions may not actually be able to destroy the Iranian economy in total. However, it will very much embolden Iranian opposition to the United States. Iran was already subject to one U.S. regime change operation, and I'm sure that the people there still are not particularly fond of the U.S. because of that. By the way, including people who oppose the current government in Iran. And if that wasn't bad enough, Iran is now proposing that in retaliation against U.S. sanctions, that they will simply close the Straits of Hormuz so that no oil can flow pretty much from the Middle East. All this Arab oil that we always hear about comes from the Gulf states, states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and of course Iran. These countries are called the Gulf states because they're all along the coast of the Persian Gulf. And there's a very narrow passage out of the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean. It's called the Straits of Hormuz. And it would be very easy for Iran simply to use their navy to block these straits so that no oil tankers can get through. Iran is essentially saying that if we can't sell our oil, nobody can. And apparently about 1/3 of all the world's oil supply flows through these straits. So the price of oil would rise astronomically. I have no idea how high. But in all likelihood, it would be over $150 a barrel, I could say that. Now, Iran couldn't maintain this blockade forever, though, because this would absolutely trigger an immediate attack from the United States. Iran cannot fend off the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. would never allow Iran to maintain this sort of blockade. Because as they even say on their own commercials, the U.S. Navy does not exist to protect the safety of Americans or anything like that. The reason why the U.S. Navy exists is to protect the shipping interests of multinational corporations and, of course, of allied states like, the monarchies in the Middle East. And so the Navy would never let Iran block all that oil and hurt the Saudi Arabians. And so this blockade would be casus belli for the U.S. to finally attack Iran and institute the regime change there by defeating them militarily and instituting a new government. The U.S. knows that if Iran blocks the Straits of Hormuz, that will be the end of the mullah's regime there. All they have to do is push Iran far enough to where they're finally willing to use that trump card, because that is the most powerful card that Iran has. However, it will probably lead to their destruction. They ought to be wise to this. The United States is very good at baiting people into making the first strike. The U.S. has managed to do that all throughout history. There have been relatively few major wars that the U.S. has been involved in to where they made the decisive first strike, which was actually the start of the war. Even if the U.S. themselves were the ones instigating the conflict, they don't like to make the first strike. So if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, be sure to click the bell so that you don't miss any of my future uploads, because I do upload every day and I will be following this story quite closely. And if Iran does block the Straits of Hormuz, I will be here to report to you on the coming war. So stay tuned for that, news about Libya and all sorts of other places. And I'll see you back here tomorrow.